When people imagine the Middle Ages, they often see cloistered monasteries, grimy peasants tilling frozen fields, and a church that hovered like a steel ceiling over every desire, silencing laughter, joy, and lust. They picture a world where love was an obligation, sex was for procreation alone, and any deviation from chastity led straight to hell. But the truth was far messier and far more human. Medieval Europe, for all its rituals and repression, pulsed with desire. In villages and cities, behind monastery walls and beneath castle banners, men and women whispered, touched, rebelled, and yearned. Despite the iron grip of religious authority, people found ways to live and love, bending rules when they had to, breaking them when they must. In the shadow of wooden cottages, where chickens scratched at muddy courtyards and the scent of firewood clung to everything, life was brutally practical. A peasant family didn't live in comfort or privacy. They lived in proximity. One-room homes housed 3, sometimes 4 generations, with no walls to divide space, no curtains to pull shut. Children, elders, parents, all slept on straw pallets beneath the same low beams, warmed by the breath of cattle just beyond the door. And yet, intimacy found its place. Once dusk settled and the tools were stored away, sex was not only a release, it was one of the few pleasures peasants could afford. There were no taverns for most, no books to read, no concerts or plays to attend. What was left was the closeness of a body beside you and the knowledge that another child might soon be born, not as a burden, but as another set of hands to sow, reap, and survive. Privacy didn't exist in the modern sense, but shame didn't either, at least not in the way we understand it now. Parents might simply wait until children slept, or send them to fetch kindling, sneaking moments of tenderness before the next day's toil. And though the church dictated that sex should only occur within marriage, and only for the purpose of procreation, reality in the fields told a different story. Many young couples engaged in premarital sex. Some were formally engaged, a kind of promise before witnesses, but others simply surrendered to the rhythm of youth and opportunity. It's estimated that up to 1/3 of medieval brides were already pregnant on their wedding day. Villagers didn't necessarily see this as scandalous. They saw it as life unfolding. If a girl conceived, the family's task wasn't punishment. It was arranging a wedding quickly enough to save her from disgrace. These unions weren't formed from tales of courtly love or romantic gestures. Marriages in rural areas were often contracts between families, arrangements based on land, livestock, and labor. And in isolated villages, where everyone was related in some distant way, even the church's prohibition on marrying within 7 degrees of kinship became an impossible standard. Most simply ignored it, or bribed a bishop for a special dispensation if they could. But peasants didn't live without consequences. Adultery was rare, not because people were more faithful, but because the community watched. If a husband strayed or a wife was unfaithful, neighbors would notice. Public shame could be brutal. In some regions, couples caught in adultery were made to wear donkey ears, ride backward through the village on a mule, or suffer the mocking chants of children and elders alike. The idea that a feudal lord had the right to sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night, the infamous jus primae noctis, is likely more legend than law. No evidence confirms it existed as a formal practice, but that didn't mean powerful men left women untouched. There are records of lords and their stewards assaulting village girls, claiming them under the guise of privilege or protection, while terrified families remained silent, or worse, convinced themselves it was an honor. Still, the peasant world wasn't one of sexual chaos. Prostitution was almost non-existent in rural areas. The village was too small, too watchful. Any woman selling her body would do so secretly, perhaps at an inn on the outskirts, or when soldiers passed through. More often, sexual life was confined to the home, to the rhythms of marriage, desire, and necessity. In this world, love was not a luxury. It was something forged in shared hardship, a hand held while birthing another child, or a stolen kiss before the frost returned. The passion was real, but shaped not by poetry, only by the mud, the fire, and the weight of survival. If the village was a place where everyone knew your name and your sins, the medieval city was the opposite: crowded, anonymous, and bursting with contradictions. Behind the fortified gates and narrow alleys, where butchers and goldsmiths shared space with monks and midwives, intimacy took on a new face. Here, morality clashed with opportunity, and sexuality slipped like smoke between the cracks of stone and scripture. The city did not sleep. By day, it was a marketplace of noise and motion, stalls brimming with figs, fabrics, and fish, beggars leaning against cathedral doors, sermons echoing from pulpits. But when dusk fell and lanterns flickered to life, the same streets transformed. Shadows swelled in the corners, windows glowed with laughter, and somewhere, beneath the distant bells, someone knocked softly on a wooden door not their own. Public bathhouses, once meant for cleanliness and health, had become something else entirely. At first, they served men and women separately, but as centuries turned and rules blurred, mixed bathing became common. In Paris, Nuremberg, Prague, people bathed together in great wooden tubs, sipping wine, sharing food, singing, and flirting beneath rising steam. Men joked, women blushed, and before long, laughter gave way to caresses. The bathhouse was not merely a place to wash. It became a theater of seduction, a kind of medieval wellness club where the body was no longer hidden and desire was never far away. Chronicles from the 14th and 15th centuries tell of bathhouses filled with joy and moaning, of nobles and bakers, merchants and students, meeting in the heat to indulge both skin and spirit. Some bathhouses doubled as discreet brothels. Others were simply tolerated as spaces where rules could bend. The church tried, again and again, to shutter them, citing corruption and sin. But the bathhouses reopened again and again because the city needed them more than it feared damnation. And if the bathhouse was too bold, there were always the brothels. Unlike in the countryside, prostitution in cities was not only common, it was regulated. By the 13th century, many towns had legalized and even operated municipal brothels. Officials taxed the madams, controlled the location of the houses, and often required prostitutes to wear distinctive clothing, yellow ribbons, striped hoods, or plain dresses, so they could be easily recognized and, paradoxically, both shunned and sought. Paris, for instance, had entire streets reserved for love for hire. So did London, Rome, and Florence. Some brothels rivaled noble homes in luxury: velvet drapes, warm baths, perfumed oil. Others were little more than damp cellars, but still found customers, for desire does not discriminate by class. Nearly every man, from the laboring apprentice to the weary priest, might one day pass through such a door. Indeed, even within churches, the supposed sanctuaries of chastity, temptation crept. Scandalous tales abound of priests consorting with prostitutes, of monks slipping coins into hands beneath their robes, of confessionals becoming sites not only of forgiveness, but of proposition. Some women sought customers inside the very cathedrals built to shame them, and the irony did not go unnoticed. Still, a prostitute lived on a blade's edge. She might earn coin enough to survive, even support a child, but she would never be welcome in polite company. In some cities, prostitutes were denied the sacraments. In others, they could not testify in court. Many wore signs of shame, dyed garments, visible marks, belts or patches to indicate their trade. And yet, not all women in the city sold their bodies for coin. There were shopgirls who flirted behind counters, widows who remarried for companionship, servants who became lovers. Love, real love, bloomed in the corners too. Serenades under balconies, secret notes passed beneath market baskets, hurried kisses between the linen and the loom. And sometimes, that love even led to marriage. City marriages, like those in the village, were often arranged. Contracts sealed for dowries, alliances, or the merging of trades. A baker's son and a butcher's daughter, a merchant's niece and a brewer's heir. But in the crowd and chaos, where anonymity allowed small rebellions. Some chose for affection. Poorer folk, with fewer assets to bind them, often married for love. Widows and widowers sought comfort, not commerce, and among them, devotion grew. Still, everything existed beneath the eternal eye of scandal. One night's mistake could lead to months of gossip. A glance could ruin a girl's name. A secret pregnancy might destroy a family. The city never stopped watching, even when it claimed not to care. At first glance, the noble courts of medieval Europe appear the most restrained of all. Gilded gowns swept across marble floors, chivalric vows echoed through banquet halls, and knights pledged undying devotion to ladies they could never touch. It was a world draped in etiquette, all refinement, propriety, and discipline. But this, like so much in the Middle Ages, was merely the surface. Beneath the pageantry lay passion, betrayal, and a labyrinth of secrets so entangled that even the most righteous kings feared their own bedrooms. Noble marriages were almost never about love. They were contracts, signed in Latin and sealed with family crests, forged to protect borders, expand dominions, and secure alliances between rival houses. Girls were often promised before their first bleeding, boys trained to inherit rather than adore. A duchess might be married at 13 to a man thrice her age, and from that moment on, her womb became a battleground for dynasty. The pressure to bear sons was relentless. A noble woman's worth was measured not by beauty or virtue, but by the strength and number of her children, specifically male heirs who could carry the family name and inherit its lands. And if she bore only daughters, or worse, none at all, whispers began. Midwives were questioned, horoscopes cast, and prayers whispered at cold altars. If all else failed, annulments were sought, under the convenient guise of consanguinity or unconsummated vows, though everyone knew the truth. She had failed to fulfill her only divine purpose. But men were not so bound. While their wives bled and wept in shadowed birthing chambers, noblemen entertained mistresses with impunity. Some affairs were fleeting. A servant girl behind a curtain, a musician after a feast. Others became institutionalized. Courtiers and kings kept official mistresses. Women granted rooms, jewels, and in some cases, influence. At the court of France, these maîtresses en titre were nearly as powerful as queens, though never crowned. King Charles IV of Bohemia had 4 wives and over a dozen children, both legitimate and otherwise. He chronicled his romantic escapades with startling candor, even naming a bastard son conceived in France. Edward IV of England was no different. His charm was legendary, and his reputation as a seducer clung to him like perfume. Courtly love, that lofty ideal of noble affection, rarely stood in the way of a well-timed tryst. Yet for noblewomen the rules were written in blood. A lady caught in adultery risked more than disgrace. If lucky, she might be confined to a nunnery for life. If not, a quiet disappearance, a fall from the stairs, or a poisoned goblet might end her story. Sometimes husbands knew and looked away, especially if the affair preserved domestic peace. Other times, a jealous lord would dispatch his wife's lover with a sword stroke to the neck and say no more. Passion among the noble class was a game played in the shadows, dangerous, electrifying, and always political. Court life was both performance and prison. Daughters were trained from infancy to dance, sew, and smile, to conceal their thoughts behind veils and fans. They learned to speak with glances, to weep without smudging coal, to flirt without violating decorum. A misstep could cost a reputation. A kiss could start a war. Still, affection bloomed. Some noble marriages, arranged in childhood, grew into genuine bonds. Other noble households, by contrast, became stages for excess. In Renaissance Italy, dukes hosted masked balls where courtesans played the muses, naked and painted in gold. In Burgundy, elaborate feasts of fools dissolved the barriers between servant and master, woman and man, virtue and vice. While the church preached restraint, the nobility sometimes reveled in spectacle. their pleasures cloaked in silk and incense. And yet, there were boundaries even at court. A knight might adore his lady from afar, pen sonnets to her eyes, wear her token on his armor. But if he touched her, he risked exile or worse. The ideal of courtly love demanded distance, a kind of sacred agony where love was pure precisely because it was forbidden. Real desire lived elsewhere, in the bedchambers, in the stables, in the spaces between duty and longing. Honor and shame moved hand in hand. A noble's public dignity was everything, even when his private life crumbled. The image of chastity was more important than the truth of it. And so, a wife might sit beside her husband at Mass, knowing his mistress awaited him that night. A lord might toast his wife while planning to disinherit her son. This was the high-wire act of medieval aristocracy, balancing appearances and appetites, legacy and longing. One misstep could destroy a house, ignite a scandal, or bring ruin to a bloodline centuries in the making. In early medieval Europe, priestly celibacy was more aspiration than law. Many village priests lived openly with concubines, women who cooked their meals, bore their children, and were wives in all but title. Bishops occasionally scolded them or demanded payment, but rarely interfered. Even monks, confined behind monastery walls, struggled in private. Some fasted or beat themselves bloody to drive out impure thoughts. Others surrendered to temptation quietly and often. The Gregorian reforms of the 11th century sought to end this. The Church declared celibacy mandatory and ordered priests to dismiss their lovers. But declarations could not erase centuries of habit or the pull of human longing. In many parishes, priests kept their partners in secret, often with the silent approval of their congregants. Better, the villagers reasoned, for a priest to live quietly with one woman than chase after others' wives or prowl after children. But such compromises enraged reformers like Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, who condemned clerical hypocrisy. Chronicles tell of brothels full of tonsured heads, of sermons interrupted by laughter when a priest's mistress was recognized in the pews. Some towns joked that if you needed a priest after dark, best check the bathhouse, not the rectory. Nuns were not untouched by this tension. Many entered convents not from calling, but because they were unwanted daughters, too costly to marry off. Their writings, when they survived, speak of aching loneliness, unfulfilled youth, and quiet rebellion. Some bore children in secret. Others fled their cloisters under cover of night. When discovered, scandals erupted. Convents were shuttered. Infants vanished into orphanages. Abbots were cast out and disgraced. Still, some lived their vows with unwavering devotion. Mystic women like Mechtild of Magdeburg or Catherine of Siena wrote of divine ecstasies that blurred the line between holiness and hunger. Their visions described Christ not only as Redeemer, but as lover, their words soaked in longing and metaphor. Whether these writings sublimated forbidden desire or elevated it into sacred poetry, they remain among the most emotionally charged texts of the age. Outside the cloister, rules were equally rigid. The Church dictated not just when couples could sleep together, avoiding Sundays, feast days, Lent, Advent, and countless others, but how. Only face-to-face was allowed. Anything else was labeled sodomy, condemned as mortal sin. Sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or nursing was forbidden. Married couples who strayed from these norms faced confession, penance, or worse. Homosexual acts were punished with burning in some cities. The word sodomy covered a range of behaviors, including same-sex relations and even excessive pleasure between spouses. Behind monastery walls, whispers grew louder. Court records reveal grim tales. Priests seducing altar boys. Monks caught in trysts that ended in exile or disgrace. The Church used the term corrupter puerorum, destroyer of boys, for such offenders, though most cases were quietly buried. Birth control, while condemned, was not unknown. Women used herbs like rue and pennyroyal to prevent conception or induce miscarriage. Some inserted vinegar-soaked sponges as makeshift barriers. Church law called this murder of the unborn. Yet even medical texts penned by monks occasionally included such recipes, cloaked as remedies for female disorders. Perhaps no myth better captures medieval anxiety about control than the chastity belt, the infamous iron undergarment allegedly locked onto women in their husband's absence. But these devices are almost certainly fabrications, forged centuries later, or misunderstood punishment tools. The real instruments of control were doctrine, shame, and surveillance. Despite it all, longing endured. Love bloomed even in the cold stone of monasteries. It crept into cloisters, wrapped around chapel columns, and fluttered in the sighs of those who lay awake at night, not dreaming of paradise, but simply wishing to be held. No vow, no edict, no sermon could smother the ancient human need for closeness. In medieval Europe, the Church did not merely guide the soul, it governed the body. Desire, though natural and constant, became a battleground of fear, control, and penance. Intimacy was bound by scripture, shadowed by shame, and judged by rules so intricate that even married love was barely spared from suspicion. Sex, the Church taught, was not a pleasure, but a duty. Its sole purpose was procreation. Passion, even between spouses, was suspect. Lustful thoughts defiled the soul. A husband who enjoyed his wife too much was warned he'd tread close to mortal sin. To enforce this purity, a calendar of prohibitions was imposed. Couples were forbidden intimacy on Sundays, feast days, during Lent and Advent, and on dozens of additional holy dates. Sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or nursing was also banned. Even how one performed the act was controlled. Only the missionary position was sanctioned. Anything else, from oral contact to mutual pleasuring, was labeled sodomy, punishable by penance, exile, or death. Homosexuality, though often unspoken, was prosecuted ruthlessly. In cities like Florence and Toulouse, men accused of same-sex relations were tried, tortured, and sometimes burned. These cases, recorded in secretive trials, reveal boys and young men dragged before inquisitors, condemned with little chance of defense. Sodomy became not just a sin, but a label wielded to destroy reputations. Between women, intimacy was harder to trace, not because it was absent, but because the Church refused to see it. Affection among nuns, widows, or female friends could blur into love, but it was rarely named. Female desire, cloaked in silence, survived in the spaces men did not watch. Yet the most heavily guarded realm was reproduction. Birth control was outlawed. The Church condemned any interference with conception as murder. Still, women passed knowledge in whispers, teas of rue or pennyroyal, vinegar-soaked sponges, charms, and herbs handed down through generations. Even monastic medical texts listed such recipes, couched as remedies for women's disorders. Knowledge survived in margins and memory, not as rebellion, but necessity. Infanticide, however, was the darkest taboo. Women who gave birth in secret were suspected immediately. Foundlings appeared on riverbanks or at monastery gates. Some hospitals installed foundling wheels, small rotating doors where mothers could leave babies anonymously. It was a quiet mercy in a world where shame could kill. Myths reflected the fears of the age. The chastity belt, often imagined as iron underwear locked onto noblewomen by jealous husbands, is likely a Renaissance fiction. Historians agree, no credible evidence proves their medieval use. The true shackles were spiritual, guilt, sermons, the threat of hell. Still, love survived. Even in this maze of punishments and commandments, the human longing for closeness could not be extinguished. It flickered in glances across marketplaces, in the touch of a midwife's hand, in the shared silence of two people who knew what they risked. The Church feared sexuality not because it was rare, but because it was powerful. It could cross class lines, unravel marriages, challenge priestly vows. It was the one force that doctrine alone could not contain. That fear shaped centuries of repression, but it also proved how strong the human heart remained. The Middle Ages left behind cathedrals and castles, manuscripts and myths. But beneath all those stone relics lies something even more human, the echo of touch, longing, and forbidden love. Behind monastery doors, beneath thatched roofs, in the steam of bathhouses or the silence of cloisters, people reached for one another, sometimes gently, sometimes recklessly, always against the grain of the world they inhabited. For all its rules and punishments, medieval society did not extinguish desire. It tried to cage it, with marriage contracts, church calendars, and public shaming, but never quite succeeded. Even as doctrine narrowed the approved expressions of love, people found ways to sidestep the barricades, to marry for affection rather than land, to court under windows and beside wells, to dream of more than what sermons allowed. They scribbled love poems in Latin margins. They arranged secret meetings under winter branches. The human heart remained porous, despite laws, despite fear. And in that defiance lies something deeply noble. What's striking is not only how different medieval ideas of intimacy were from ours, but how familiar they remain. We still inherit the weight of certain myths. That pleasure should be controlled. That women's desire is dangerous. That purity is virtue and flesh is sin. These roots stretch deep, and many took hold in medieval soil. Even now we marry in churches echoing with doctrines first whispered in the 12th century. We speak of sacred unions, of marital duty, of temptation, often without knowing where these ideas come from. The medieval church shaped more than religious life. It shaped the architecture of private experience, of love, of guilt, of permission. And yet the Middle Ages also remind us that people have always resisted silence. They bent the rules, dared to love in secret, and trusted their senses over sermons, not because they were heretics, but because they were human. They wanted to be touched, to be chosen, to be forgiven not for loving, but for living. In their letters, in their quiet joys and terrible punishments, we find reflections of ourselves. The woman married at 14 who later wrote to her husband with tenderness after decades apart. The priest who confessed his desire in a side chapel, hoping not for absolution, but for understanding. The girl who drank bitter herbs not out of rebellion, but out of fear. The lovers who met once, only once, yet remembered it until their last breath. The story of medieval intimacy is not one of saints and sinners. It is one of ordinary souls navigating extraordinary rules. Perhaps the greatest lesson the Middle Ages offer is not how different we are, but how much we carry forward. History records wars and kings, but love too leaves a trace. If you enjoyed this story, trust me, the next ones will be even more powerful. You're about to hear things no one else is telling. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming. If this video moved you, leave a like and drop a comment. And most importantly, share it with someone you care about. See you in the next video.